Welcome to my writing channel, which is all about the craft of writing and also book reviews. And to that end, we have Breaking Day by Adam Oyebanji. I hope I've said that name correctly. But anyway, so this is actually his first novel, and not just first sci-fi novel. And overall, it's pretty damn good. Actually, as you can see, it's what 355 pages. Also, the text is fairly big, so it's a relatively brisk read. As I've mentioned previously, and as I'm going to continue to mention, I'm a very slow reader, and even this I finished in about 2 to 2.5 weeks. So even then, it's quite interesting. The story goes at quite a fast-paced pace. Also, the chapters are relatively small. They're mostly quite concise. There's very little fluff. There's very little filler. So this is basically a thriller, but set in space, and it goes amongst three generation ships, which have been sent from Earth about 132 years ago, and they're traveling to a new planet, Tau Ceti, I believe it's called. I think that's how to pronounce it. And it's basically going to become Earth 2.0, and we're essentially going to learn all of the mistakes, all of the errors, everything bad that we've done on Earth, we're not going to do on this new Earth. And to that end, we've commissioned three giant space generation ships, and Ravinder, and his cousin Boz, also known as Roberta, they're the McLeods, and they're on the main ship Archimedes. And so the reason it's called Breaking Day is that they've been sent out, and the ships have been burning this entire time. However, soon the time is coming to when they're going to start breaking, and then they're actually, going to start coasting towards the planet. They're going to basically go into an orbit as they analyze more of the planet, send down probes, and then eventually going to land on the planet. And so, yeah, it's all about the big day when they, flip the ships around and then, start breaking towards their destination. However, as you discover, and as the characters are discovering, not everyone is entirely happy about this day. Some people are quite happy with their lives aboard the ships, especially, the upper class. As you can guess, the McLeods, these two, Ravi and Boz, they're not part of the upper class. They wouldn't say that they're downtrodden, but they're definitely looked down upon. And so it's basically up to them to solve the mystery. So there is the main mystery going in the story, but there's also a number of sort of sub mysteries as well. And every single mystery is essentially connected to a ticking clock. And so that's one of the ways in which the story goes quite fast. It's at a very rapid pace. The dialogue moves fairly quickly as well. And like I said, there's not too much fluff or filler. But the only problem with the pace of the book, because it is so relentless, is that it doesn't allow much room, or any room, sort of any breathing space, any sort of downtime. There's not a lot of time, not a lot of space to really breathe in the world, because you always get a sense that there's always something around the corner. Now, obviously, when you're reading any sort of book, or if you're writing yourself, obviously the story has to progress. Obviously, we're always learning something new. But the idea is that it's written in such a way that you don't realize it. If two characters are talking, and they're talking about something that seems inconsequential to the story, whether that's, a TV, movie, or a book, then it just seems that way. A good story, a good book, or a good movie makes it seem like it's inconsequential, whereas in reality, you're learning something. However, the problem with this book, there's lots of twists and turns. However, you soon start to realize that, so early on, you might be fooled or you might be sucked in. However, later down the track, and I say even about 100 pages in, you start to clue onto the fact that virtually every interaction, no matter how random it seems, is going to play on, is going to have sort of it's going to play out at some point in the book. It's going to have a payoff, Chekhov's gun. The problem with this is that it's somewhat distracting. It's hard to lose yourself in the story because everything, that virtually everything is going to play out at some point later on in the book, even if you don't quite know when exactly it's going to play out. You sort of get that nagging feeling. And part of this is that there's no real downtime in the story. And so, for example, the previous book that I reviewed for my channel was Coming Home. Now, that's a relatively similar book in that it's all about a mystery. However, there is one scene that really stood out to me, and it was only a few pages from memory. However, that really slowed down the pace. And so, not to spoil it or anything, but basically, the main character, she's in a little ship and she pulls up next to a really large vessel, and something has gone wrong. Now, you know pretty immediately that something has gone wrong. However, the pace slows down just for a few pages where the character, just on her own, is roaming the ship, trying to figure out what went wrong. And it really lets you in, really lets you sort of breathe, lets you sort of breathe in the story a bit and really take stock of what is happening. It also allows you to build up a bit more dread because it's such a quiet moment. You can sort of imagine if this was in a TV show or a movie, there's no background music. And it's just quietly, and you sort of, as you're reading, you're sort of wondering what could possibly have happened, even as you know deep down, you're hoping for the best, but deep down, you really know, you really understand that something terrible has happened. And there's nothing like that in this book. And so that's sort of part of the problem with the relentless pace of the book. However, in saying all of this, the story and indeed the mysteries were irresistible. And that's one of the reasons why I finished the book in 2 to 2.5 weeks, whereas normally such a book would have taken me probably a month, maybe even 5 weeks to read. However, I couldn't put it down, despite some of the flaws in the writing. So the other thing is that this is written in third person and entirely from Rabbi or Rabbi's point of view. And to that end, I noticed there were a few mistakes, through only a few, whereby it's from his point of view. However, for a sentence or two, just sparingly throughout the book, it actually describes what another character is thinking. Whereas from his point of view, he cannot possibly know. He can guess, or he can make an educated guess what the other character is thinking, but he can't actually know. Now, it's not a huge deal. Like I said, it only happened a few times, like I think 4 or 5 times, but it did sort of jump out at me a little bit of a amateur or rookie error, I guess, or just an error from a first-time author. Oh yeah, and the other thing is because this is set far into the future, language has changed, all that. And now instead of swear words, there's actually no swear words at all in the book. Everyone uses the term sarding. So, instead of this is a fucking shit situation, this is a sarding situation. And, I understand obviously language undergoes changes all the time, but it's hard to relate to some of the, some of the bad scenes that happen when a character says sard or this is sarding bad or whatever, because, it really takes the edge of what's happening. Because, like, you see a really bad situation, you might think, oh, fuck, or something like that. And, if you read that, you really get a sense of how bad the situation must be. However, in here, it's hard to get what's harder to get a sense of how bad the situation is. It's harder to empathize because, they keep saying sard or sardine. And there are a few other creative insults and other ways to not swear in the book. And it's, on one hand, it's unique. I get that. And, the author, for whatever reason, just didn't want any swearing in his book. On the other hand, it did make it a bit harder to connect to the characters. And so in my opinion, if you don't want any swearing in your book, just get down the route of Star Wars. That doesn't have any swearing in it. And if you do want to go down the swearing route, just use fuck, shit, and all those other bad words, but just use them sparingly. And so when the word is used, it really means something. Whereas I think this is in between, and it was a little bit distracting. Yes, one of the consequences, or one of the potential consequences for people who really, really mess up and are in trouble with the law in the book, is that you can essentially get mulched, or that's what it's called, and it's essentially where you get dissolved, I guess. It doesn't really describe how it goes down, but you can sort of imagine that you sort of get washed in really powerful chemicals and you're sort of recycled into the ship. Because as these are generation ships and they've been traveling for 132 years, you have to do as much recycling as possible. And so, of course, amongst these 3 generation ships, they cannot possibly allow repeat offenders. And in fact, from the very first page, actually, you find out that Ravi's father was a repeat offender, and he actually got mulched. And it's quite shocking when you first hear that. You're like, whoa! It really allows you to sort of get a feel for what kind of society this is and what kind of society can survive for 132 years, because that is what would be required. You can't be lenient, you can't be soft on crime when thousands of lives depend on every single person essentially having a role. It doesn't really mention, homelessness or any people without jobs or anything like that. Essentially, as far as I could tell with the story, everyone's got a role, and that makes sense. And that's why one of the themes with the story is a really strict hierarchy. You have some families who are at the top, like the navigators or the people in charge of security, and then you have the McLeods, which do more run-of-the-mill jobs. However, in Ravi's case, he's actually a trainee engineer, and this would actually put him in a better social standing. However, his entire family, he's the first of his family to go down this route. And so, you understand that why his family would be giving him a bit of shit for that, or he's sort of ribbing him, or, trying to bring him down to their level. But yeah, in terms of, the threat of getting mulched, that being waved in someone's face, like I said, it's quite shocking when you hear that this happened to his father. However, it's brought up a few too many times. And by the last time that, it's brought up as a threat to a character, it doesn't really mean much. It's not as shocking anymore. I think it would have been better to use that a bit more sparingly. And so, not that this changes the quality of writing in any way, I was actually drawn to the actual front cover, but in a bad way. And so, to me, the front cover looks really cheap. Maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm judging too harshly, but the ship itself looks really good. But then, you got this glare, and it sort of makes sense to have this sort of glare, because then it can cast a sort of a light on the two characters here. But then the characters themselves look like they were sort of cut out from another scene, from a green screen, and then put on here. But then, the lighting doesn't match, and it makes them look really, really cheap. And that's initially the reason why I actually picked up the book. I was like, it sort of really stuck out to me, is that that's a really good looking ship. But then the two characters, Ravi and then another girl, yeah, they looked really cheap. And it was only when I sort of read the back and that I sort of thought, oh, this sort of sounds interesting. I like to really take my time before buying a book. And so I was reading the back, I was thinking to myself, this sounds quite interesting. It sounds quite irresistible, the mystery behind it. And to that end, I was right. So I'm glad that the really cheap cover drew me to the book. Although I do wish I had a bit of a better cover. And so hopefully the author next time, for his next book, hires a better illustrator. And actually, just before wrapping up the spoiler-free review, the story does tease a super, super cheesy romance. Luckily, the story does not go down that route. I was really scared for a second, because basically Ravi, he's a bit of a schlob. And, as you've seen in a million different pieces of media over the course of your life, he falls for the really hot chick because she's so hot. And of course, he's helping her with the homework and getting a bit closer to her. And I was like, oh my God. And also, you're not going to believe this. You'll be shocked, I'm sure. She also has an asshole boyfriend. And, he's really trying to worm his way into her heart. But even though the story sets that up, thankfully, it does not pay off. And it pays off in a different way than you might imagine. And I'll get into that ending in my spoiler section. But suffice to say that the really, really potentially cheesy love story that could have played out doesn't. It gets teased, but it doesn't play out. So that is definitely +1 in favor for the book. However, to round off this spoiler-free review, overall, I have to give this around a 7, maybe 6.5 to a 7, something like that. Overall, it is very good. It is very enjoyable. However, there are quite a number of pitfalls, especially to do with the pacing. Because the pacing is so relentless, it does make it harder to really get sucked into the story. And the writing is also a little bit distracting in the sense that everything pays off. And once you find that out, once you sort of feel that as you're reading, that is also quite distracting, can really take you out of the story. Other than that, much like myself, I think you will find that the mystery overall irresistible. Regardless of the shortcomings of the book, the mystery and the mysteries, as they evolve over the book, they will keep you hooked no matter how slow of a reader you are. You will finish this book just as quickly as I did. And so, as I mentioned in the spoiler-free section, there is no really cheesy romance. However, right at the end of the book, the girl that he's really into, that he virtually knows nothing about, and he's still a bit of a schlub at the end. So basically, he's actually discovered, he and Boz, they discover that there's a fourth ship. And this ship has been dark the entire time, and they actually have to save both ships from each other because essentially what's happening is there's Breaking Day that's coming up. However, both ships are also secretly arming themselves and getting ready to blow each other up. And it's all to do with the differences in ideologies across both ships. So Ravi and his cousin Boz, they travel to the other ship, and then they have to travel back. And they basically have to convince the captain of this ship, and basically these AIs, or who are basically weapons platforms, and their own ships, and they can do really crazy things. And these are going to be used by this fourth ship to destroy the three ships in the fleet. And Ravi and his cousin, they stop that, and then they have to come back to Archimedes. And things are not looking so hot in Archimedes because someone has actually planted a bomb, a really hard to detect bomb on all three ships. And basically, these are not bombs in your conventional sense. What they're going to do is they're going to short the drives, and then all three ships, they'll be basically coasting. And because they're coasting, they can't break and they actually can't land on the planet. So what you find out is that the chick that Ravi was falling for, even though once again he knows nothing about her, is that she's not necessarily someone who wants to save the new Earth. She actually likes things the way they are. And like I said, because of the whole class system, she really believes in the class system. And she's going to be a navigator. And so that's obviously really good for her and bad for pretty much everyone else. Because essentially one of the things that's envisioned when everyone lands on the new planet is that they're not going to need the really strict hierarchy that's required to keep all three or four ships running. And so as Ravi and his cousin come back to Archimedes, they're arrested. And Ravi in particular, he's in a lot of trouble. And things are not looking good for him because there's a lot of evidence, or a lot of people believe that he's the one that planted these essentially invisible bombs. For whatever reason, they can't be picked up by normal detection methods. And so he's the one that raised the alarm about these bombs. But then ship's security is really suspicious. And they're like, you've been telling us about these bombs, but we can't find them. Why? Like, how do you know about them? And he's basically, Ravi's Hail Mary is to get her to come down, Sophie, or Soph, as he calls her a few times, Sophie to come down and essentially confess to him. And you sort of get this idea that things are a little bit different between them because before, there's potential for a bit of romance, blah, blah, blah. However, now, as soon as she actually steps into the cell, there's a little bit of a standoff between them. And essentially, Ravi's friend had to try and convince her to come down by saying that Ravi is feeling suicidal. And before he commits suicide, he's going to write a note. And now, obviously, she knows that everyone on the ship knows that these bombs have been planted and she's the one that did it. Or at the very least, she was instrumental in planting these bombs. And so she thinks that he's going to write down, in his suicide note that, that he knows that it's her. However, because he's lower on the hierarchy, essentially she feels immune because no one would believe him anyway. No one would believe that she did it. Or they would essentially allow her to get away with it, sort of thing. But so she comes down and she asks him, what is he going to write on his note? And, there's a little bit of backwards and forwards. It's a little bit tense. And then, it's going through his monologue as he's, talking to her. And he's so frustrated, he's disappointed. He's like, oh, man, all the feelings that I had for her, she never had any for me. And I'm thinking, duh. Like, you knew nothing about her other than that she was really hot. Oh my God, she's so hot. Like, basically every time he meets her, it's like, oh my God, she's so pretty. She's so thin. She's so delicate, blah, blah, blah. And now right at the end of the book, he's surprised that, she would feel nothing for him. Because basically at one point he tells her, and this is one of the other things I was mentioning in the spoiler-free section, that, they're threatening him with getting mulched. That, it's essentially a death penalty for him. And she doesn't react. It's like, yeah, duh. Of course she didn't care about you the entire time. And like, it's funny because he's such a pathetic schlob, whereas he's gone on this crazy journey. And it's sort of hard to square the two. That he's this badass that's gone on this crazy journey this entire book, of both mentally and physically. But then comes to the end and he's still a bum schlob who can't believe that the girl that he fell for doesn't feel the same way for him, even though, like I keep pointing out, he knows nothing about her. And so one of the things he does to convince her to reveal where she planted or how she planted the bombs so they can defuse them in time is that he plays back a recording because, like I said, of course her boyfriend is an asshole, and he met the boyfriend and another girl, surprise surprise, the boyfriend is also cheating, earlier in the story. And the boyfriend obviously knows that he's been caught out with another girl, and so he goes up to Ravi and Boz and says, oh, Sophie, she's such a Klingon, or I can't possibly stand her anymore, blah blah blah. Typical cliche stuff. And as it turns out, Ravi was recording the conversation, and he plays that back for Sophie, and it's all so cheesy. It's like as he's talking to this boyfriend, he's like, oh man, this boyfriend's such an asshole. I better record this just to show Sophie later on what an asshole her boyfriend is. Anyway, so yeah, he plays back the recording, and then she's distraught, and then she reveals how she planted these bombs. And then he says, okay, so the game is up, and I'm going to report you. And she's like, oh, well, it doesn't really matter anyway, because no one's going to believe your word. It's going to be, my word, I'm upper class, versus your word. But then it turns out he's recording again. And that recording essentially saves his life at the end of the story. It's interesting. So obviously they discover these 3 invisible bombs, and they're able to start breaking day, of course, towards the end of the book. However, it's interesting that the ending, there's no kumbaya moment at the end. Like I mentioned in my previous review of the book To Swim in a Sea of Stars, or something like that, the same guy who wrote Aragon, that really had an ending where it's all kumbaya. Everyone holds hands and all sins are forgotten and everything's all good at the end. Actually, at the end of this story, even though all 4 ships are alive, there's quite a lot of tension between both sets of crews, because essentially Boz and Ravi, they brokered essentially a peace deal, but neither side is entirely happy with it. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the next book, because it's first part. I guess the next book will be called Landing Day, and it's going to be all the tensions and everything associated with both groups landing on the same planet, now that everyone is able to do so. So, like I said, overall, even though writing can be a little bit clunky, it's a little bit amateurish at times. Overall, I think you will thoroughly enjoy it, especially if you've got through this spoiler section. I think perhaps you might even enjoy it a little bit more, knowing what you know. So, thank you for watching this review. If you wouldn't mind subscribing and sharing my videos, that would be amazing. It would help my channel grow, and help me eventually earn money from this channel, which is obviously good for me, and also reach a wider audience. Also, check out my primary channel, because this is my second channel. My primary channel is all about economics, so check that out at Petard Economics. That's PETAR Economics. But otherwise, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.